At first, everything seemed perfect. We had the kind of relationship that people envied: good communication, lots of laughter, and a genuine sense of closeness. We'd been together for a few years, and I thought we had a strong foundation. I was the type of person who believed in love, in trust, and in sticking by each other no matter what. But over time, something started to change. It was subtle at first, just little things that didn't sit right with me. I kept telling myself I was overthinking, that I was imagining things, but deep down I knew something was off. It started with the small signs: the texts he would send late at night, always with a hurried tone, followed by him slipping his phone back into his pocket like he didn't want me to see. He'd often be on his phone for hours, but when I asked about it, he'd brush it off like it was no big deal. Just work stuff, he'd say. I wanted to believe him. After all, we had built a life together, and he was the man I trusted most. But the more I thought about it, the more that answer didn't make sense. If it were just work, why did he get so defensive about it? And why was he suddenly more distant when we spent time together? It wasn't just his phone habits that were changing. He started staying late at the office more often. I'd hear the familiar excuse: I have a project to finish, or the team's relying on me. At first, I thought it was just the pressures of work piling up. But then it became more frequent. A few times he didn't even come home at all. He'd crash at a friend's place or stay in the city to finish his work. I trusted him enough to give him space, but something in me began to wonder if I was being naive. Maybe he was telling the truth, or maybe there was something he wasn't saying. It wasn't just the physical absence, it was the emotional distance too. He stopped sharing things with me the way he used to. He didn't talk about his day, his thoughts, or even his plans. It was like I was living with a stranger, someone who was only half there. And it wasn't just the late nights or his phone that raised red flags. I noticed little changes in how he treated me. There were fewer compliments, less affection. We'd sit on the couch together, but he seemed to be lost in his own world. When I tried to initiate a conversation, he'd nod, smile, and then quickly retreat into his own thoughts. I kept wondering if it was just a phase, or if I was imagining the distance growing between us. But then, one evening, I was cleaning up in the kitchen when I found something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A strange email notification popped up on his laptop screen. It was brief, just a few words, but the tone felt off. It was addressed to him, but the sender wasn't someone I recognized. It was a name I'd never heard before. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to ignore the rush of panic that hit me. I didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was nothing, but as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I was torn between trusting my gut and trusting him, but the nagging feeling only grew stronger. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe I was just being dramatic. But deep down, I couldn't help but wonder, was he hiding something from me? And if he was, what was it? The first real clue came when I was cleaning out his jacket pockets. I didn't set out to go snooping, but something in me just couldn't let go of the feeling that something was wrong. It was a Saturday morning, and he had left for the gym, leaving his jacket hanging on the back of the door. I was tidying up, and as I walked past it, I couldn't help but notice the jacket, almost calling to me. Maybe it was because the uncertainty had been gnawing at me for days now. I kept thinking about the way he'd been acting, the way he was always just a little bit off, like he was hiding something. I told myself I wasn't going to do anything suspicious. I wasn't the kind of person who would go through someone's things, especially not his. But in that moment, it felt like I had no other choice. I needed answers. I knew that if I didn't get to the bottom of this, I'd go crazy. So I reached into the pocket and pulled out a crumpled receipt. At first, it didn't seem like much. Receipts are just receipts, right? But when I unfolded it, I saw the name of a hotel I'd never heard of before. I read it again, just to be sure. My heart started to race. The date on the receipt was recent, way too recent, and the time of check-in was listed for the evening before. I felt a cold rush of panic hit me. I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly what this meant. The hotel was nice, but it wasn't the kind of place anyone would book for a business trip, and that wasn't the kind of hotel he'd choose for an overnight stay with friends. It was a romantic place, the kind of place you'd go to get away from everything, just the two of you. I could feel the walls closing in around me as I stood there holding the receipt in my hand. Every rational part of me told myself not to jump to conclusions, to stay calm and think it through. But the more I thought about it, the more the puzzle pieces started to fit together in a way I didn't want them to. I kept going over everything in my mind. The late nights, the distant attitude, the odd behavior with his phone, it all seemed to line up with this receipt. I couldn't ignore the signs any longer. I didn't want to, but I had to admit it to myself. I was being cheated on. The realization hit me like a punch in the stomach. How could I not have seen this coming? The trust I had in him felt like it was slipping through my fingers. The man I thought I knew, the one I had built my life with, was hiding something from me. I stood there for a long time, the receipt still clutched in my hand. I couldn't decide whether I was angry, heartbroken, or just numb. I didn't know what to do next. The last thing I wanted was to confront him without having more proof. I needed to be sure. So I slipped the receipt back into his jacket pocket, pretending like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I had the proof I needed, and there was no going back. I felt like I was on the edge of a cliff, staring down at a reality I wasn't ready to face. And yet, I couldn't turn away from it. The truth was there, waiting for me, and I knew deep down that I had to find out more. The next step, whatever it was, couldn't be avoided any longer. I couldn't stop thinking about that receipt. Every time I closed my eyes, it was there, mocking me, reminding me that the life I thought I was living was a lie. It gnawed at me every second, every minute, until I felt like I was losing my grip on everything. I tried to distract myself with work and socializing, but it was always there in the back of my mind, pulling me deeper into doubt. I needed more. I couldn't just sit back and wait for the truth to come to me. I had to take control. So I started looking for answers. At first, it was small things, checking his phone when he wasn't around. I'd never done that before, but in that moment I couldn't help myself. His phone had always been his, and I respected his privacy, but now it felt like the only way to get closer to the truth. He had been so careful lately, always locking it before leaving the room or turning it face down when he set it on the table. It made me suspicious, even though I hated that I was starting to think this way. One evening, I saw him leave the house to run an errand. It wasn't the first time, but this time I saw it as an opportunity. I grabbed his phone from the counter and unlocked it, thankfully. He hadn't put a password on it, so I didn't need to guess. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding in my chest. I was terrified of what I might find, but I had to look. The first thing I checked was his messages. There, buried among the routine conversations and work-related texts, was a message that stood out like a sore thumb. It was from an unknown number and it said, "Can't wait to see you tonight." My stomach flipped. I felt sick, but I kept reading. There were more messages, all with similar tones and a strange intimacy between them. They weren't just flirtatious, they were suggestive, full of promises I didn't want to imagine. I quickly closed the messages and opened his call log. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the name at the top. He'd been calling this person regularly, at odd hours of the night. I knew I was right. It wasn't just some random fling or an innocent friendship. He was having an affair. The more I saw, the more the pieces fell into place. I scrolled through the history, each message and call confirming what I already feared. I wanted to cry, to scream, but I stayed silent, my hands gripping his phone so hard that my knuckles turned white. But I wasn't done. There had to be more. I wasn't going to stop now. I had to know everything. So I checked his location history. It was almost exactly what I had expected. His phone's GPS had tracked him to places that weren't on his usual route, places I didn't recognize. One location stood out, a neighborhood that wasn't anywhere near his usual spots. I had no idea where it was, but the fact that he'd been there so often couldn't be a coincidence. My heart sank further. It was time to take the next step. I needed to follow him. I hated myself for even considering it, but I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. I had to confront it head-on. The puzzle was nearly complete. I had the evidence, the proof that he had been lying to me for so long. I didn't know how I was going to handle it, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to live in the dark anymore. The decision to follow him wasn't one I made lightly. Every part of me hated the idea, but at that point I felt like I had no choice. I couldn't sit back anymore, waiting for him to eventually come clean or hoping that the truth would somehow surface. I had gathered enough evidence: his late nights, the strange messages, the hotel receipt, but this was the final piece of the puzzle. I needed to know who he was with, where he was going, and why he was lying to me. That afternoon, I waited for him to leave. He said he had to meet a friend, but something about the way he said it made me suspicious. His tone was too casual, and I could tell he was trying to avoid making eye contact. He kissed me on the cheek as he left, but I didn't feel the usual warmth in the gesture. Instead, it felt cold, mechanical. I watched him get into his car and drive off, and I waited a few minutes before following. My heart was racing as I pulled out of the driveway, trying to keep a safe distance. I didn't want him to catch on, but at the same time I couldn't stop myself. I was desperate for answers. He took a route I wasn't familiar with, heading out of the neighborhood and into a part of town I rarely saw him in. I kept my distance, trying not to make it obvious that I was following him. Every turn he made seemed to take me further and further from where I thought he'd be, and a sick feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. He eventually turned down a quiet street and parked in front of a small house. The place was tucked away in a secluded area, surrounded by trees and privacy. It didn't look like much from the outside, just a modest, two-story house, but everything about it screamed secret. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him get out of the car and walk up to the door, a sense of dread washing over me. I stayed parked a few blocks away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers began to numb. I watched him go inside, and for a long moment, I just sat there, trying to process what I was seeing. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. Was this really happening? Was he really seeing someone else? And if so, what did that mean for us? I couldn't just sit in the car all day watching him. The anxiety was suffocating, and I had to do something. I decided to drive around the block, trying to find a spot where I could get a better look at the house without being too obvious. I parked in a spot far enough away that he wouldn't see me, but close enough that I could keep an eye on the front door. I sat there for what felt like hours, but it was probably only an hour or so before he came back outside. My heart sank as he walked out of the house with someone else. A woman. She was shorter than me, with dark hair and an easy smile. They exchanged a brief hug before he got into the car, and she stood there, waving as he drove off. I couldn't stop staring. The reality of what I was seeing hit me hard. This wasn't just a random fling or a one-time mistake. This was something serious, something he had been hiding from me for who knows how long. The woman didn't even look like she was trying to hide her relationship with him. It was obvious. I watched them, my heart shattered in pieces, trying to process everything I had just witnessed. He was cheating on me. It was no longer a suspicion, it was the truth. And that truth felt like it was suffocating me. I waited for him to come home, my stomach twisted in knots, each minute feeling like an eternity. I knew what I had seen, and there was no denying it anymore. The house, the woman, the way they acted around each other, it was all a confirmation of the truth I had been dreading. He was cheating on me. My whole body felt heavy with the weight of it, but I had no idea how I was going to confront him, or what I was even going to say. I just knew I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't act like everything was fine when it so clearly wasn't. When he finally walked through the door, he didn't seem to notice anything was different. He was his usual self, distracted, as though he hadn't done anything out of the ordinary. He kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day in a tone that was too casual, and tossed his keys on the counter like it was just another regular evening. But I couldn't fake it anymore. The gap between us felt like an ocean. Every word he spoke seemed to make my anger swell, and every part of me wanted to scream, but I kept it in. I was trying to hold it together, at least long enough to get the answers I needed. I had to be calm. I had to be composed. The emotional chaos inside me was threatening to spill out, but I knew that confronting him with rage wasn't going to get me the answers. It would just feed his lies, give him another chance to deflect. So I forced myself to breathe and decided to hit him with what I knew. I started with the simplest thing, the hotel receipt. I asked him where it was from. He looked at me, confused at first, then quickly recovered, trying to act nonchalant. "It's nothing," he said. "Just an old receipt. I must have picked it up at work." My heart pounded. I wasn't buying it. I already knew the truth, and his attempt to brush it off only made me more sure that I was right. So I pushed further. I told him I knew about the calls, the messages, and what I had seen earlier that day. I watched his face change in an instant, the defensive walls going up, his eyes shifting uncomfortably. He could no longer deny it. The silence between us became unbearable, and I could see the guilt in his eyes, even if he wasn't willing to admit it. Finally, he confessed. But it wasn't a confession that offered any relief. It wasn't full of remorse or explanations, just a quick admission of the truth, followed by him shifting the blame onto everything else: stress, work, his own issues. But the one thing he never mentioned was me. He never took responsibility for how much he had hurt me. It was clear from his words and his tone that he hadn't considered the pain he was causing. He hadn't thought about how his actions were tearing apart the trust and the love I had given him. I stood there feeling empty, like a part of me had just been ripped away. The weight of his betrayal hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. But as the words came out of his mouth as he tried to justify himself, I realized something even more crushing. He wasn't even sorry for what he'd done. Maybe he was sorry it was caught, but not truly sorry for how deeply he had betrayed me. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to beg for him to care, or fight to salvage something that had already been destroyed. This wasn't the person I thought I knew. This wasn't the life I had signed up for. The pain was real, but so was the relief of finally knowing the truth. And while the betrayal cut deep, it also gave me the clarity I needed to start moving on. I couldn't fix us. I couldn't undo what had been done. But I could walk away. And that was exactly what I did. I left. I gathered my things and walked out the door. It hurt, but it was the only way to heal. The truth had set me free, even though it was the hardest thing I'd ever had to face.